examples, and you can read the details in the book. First, the most obvious one is textiles, because India was the world leader in textiles going back to the days of the Roman Empire and right up to the British colonial period. In fact, there were anecdotes in the British press in the 17th and 18th centuries of British manufacturers making goods and trying to pass them off in British shops as Indian, as made in India, because that fetched a better price than the shoddy imitations made in Britain, okay? So that was India's reputation. The muslin made in Bengal was so fine, so high quality, that it was said they were as light as woven air. And the British came, they destroyed the looms, at least in one incident recounted by a Dutch contemporary at that time. They cut off the thumbs of weavers, they couldn't weave again. They destroyed these master craftsmen, of course, replaced them with British cloth, eventually, of course, with mass-manufactured, machine-made cloth that was flooding into India. They raised tariffs on any exports from India, and they had no tariffs. They removed tariffs on British cloth coming into India to completely destroy the Indian industry. That was one example. There's much more than that in the book. A second one, which will surprise many of you as it surprised me, was steel. India was actually the world's leading producer of steel. We'd invented steel. It was known in the south in a Kannada word as ukku steel. The Arabs discovered it, took it to Damascus, where it got better known as Damascus steel. The British and the Western world mispronounced ukka as urka, and it became wood steel, W-O-O-T-Z, which sounds vaguely German. It's not, actually Indian. And the British, in fact, Indian steel was so famous that when the British first came to India, in military engagements, they would kill Indian soldiers, dismount from their horses, and steal the Indian swords, because they were so much superior to the swords the Western soldiers were carrying. That was our thing, and of course the British destroyed that completely, did not allow India to manufacture any steel, and of course insisted on exporting British steel, and did everything possible to prevent Indians from making steel, including raising various impediments when Jamshedji Tata tried to set up a modern steel plant, insisted that any manufactured steel in India had to conform to the British specifications, which deprived India of 90% of the world market, so on and so forth. There's a lot more there on steel. Shipbuilding. We used to make amazingly good ships. Again, the Bengal shipbuilding industry, the Tamil shipbuilding industry, and the shipbuilding on the West Coast was all world class. It was estimated partly because our wood was so much better. Our teak and mahogany were better than their fir and pine. We actually had ships that lasted at least 20 years in those days, whereas the British ships never lasted more than 6 or 7 years. And so Indian ships were highly admired around the world. And of course, the British, through combination of measures, including laws and restrictions, made the Indian shipbuilding industry completely unviable. And then the fourth thing was agriculture. India had a thriving agricultural system. There were certainly zamindars and rent collectors, but there was no landlessness and no poverty. There was a tremendous social compact throughout. These have all been documented, a lot of scholarship on this. I'm just summarizing other people's research. But for example, if there was a famine or a drought, people didn't have to pay the tax. If there was a festivity or a wedding in the family, waivers were given. There was a lot of mutual understanding and give and take, and taxes never exceeded at their peak 15% of the crop or the value of the crop. When the British came in, they had a totally different attitude to this. Taxation was absolutely rapacious. They insisted on it being paid. The minimum, the lowest tax known in British India was 45% of the crop. Most of the time it was 90, 95. Even the entire crop had to be paid as taxation. The punishments were utterly punitive for those who didn't pay. They were stripped, beaten, tortured, all sorts of things that have been described in various accounts, including in the British Parliament during the impeachment of Warren Hastings. The tax collection methods were described in rather gruesome detail by the playwright Sheridan. There's a lot there that you can look at in the book that talks about all this. But in the process, what happened? A number of peasants were completely ground into the dust. Some actually fled their own lands, company lands, to go and seek refuge in princely states beyond the East India Company's remit. On top of that, the British decided to create conditions familiar to what they knew in Britain. So they created land settlements. So people who had been rent collectors in the past suddenly became landlords, and they owned the land. And the land was written in their names. And the people who had farmed the land and regarded it as their own suddenly became tenants and sharecroppers. And they then, of course, in many cases, as employees who could be hired and fired, began to lose land, and rural landlessness and rural poverty came into being. So you really have a horrendous result. Now, the British may say all they were trying to do was replicate the arrangements of the home counties, the squirearchy, and so on, that they're used to, but the result was to create and deepen acute rural poverty. So these were the, sorry, no. So these were just some of the examples: steel, shipbuilding, textiles, and agriculture. But above all, of course, it was that whatever profits the British would extract from India were not spent in India, they were shipped off to England, and the economic drainage of resources was horrendous. By the way, one of the best books on this was written in the 19th century by Dadabhai Naoroji. And he was very much a liberal in the old-fashioned, an Anglophile initially, somebody committed to seeing the positives of British rule. But he titled his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. He was telling the British, you behaved in an un-British way in my country. That was the message he was trying to give.
Well, that sounds nicer.
That should have been the section title.
I'm not sure where you stand in the book on corruption. Whether your knowledge that it was not unknown, it's a nice phrase there, not unknown in India before the Brits arrived and plumbed new depths. And I'm not sure whether you're saying that the Brits did it or the Indian people did it or whatever. Robert Clive amassed £400,000, which is now about £4 million, you say. Sounds to me like a lady chief minister's birthday bash. Oh. Three or four times Jaya Lalita's declared wealth last year.
I'm not saying a word.
So corruption, who did it to who?
No, I mean, the corruption that the British indulged in was truly quite extraordinary, though, because, frankly, in India, there'd always been loot. People would come in, attack, ravage, steal from palaces, treasuries, 1739. And Nadir Shah stole so much from Delhi, looted so much of Delhi's treasures from the Mughal court, that for the following three years, they had a tax holiday in Persia. Literally, the government was so flush with funds from their loot in Delhi, they didn't actually need to tax the Persian people. So loot is something we're familiar with. But what the British did was, of course, they put a fine gloss on it. So it was always done with pieces of paper and signatures and exaction of tribute. So Warren Hastings would go and twist the arms of landlords and zamindars and princes and say, you have to give me basically the entire contents of your treasury. And then he would go to the board of directors of East India Company saying, for my pains, I hope I can keep £100,000. And of course, you'll get the rest, which was, let's say, £300,000. And the board of directors would say, of course, you deserve it, fine man, for having stolen so much for us. Now, I mean, that kind of thing happened all the time. And the British certainly carried this on to fine art. One of the interesting things I talk about later in the book, and maybe John's about to come to that, there's one very interesting episode during the partition of Bengal in 1905, when they were trying to consciously create Hindu-Muslim divide in India. And so they wanted to divide Bengal into a principally Muslim-populated population in the east and Hindu in the west. And at that point, the principal Muslim Nawab was the Nawab of Dhaka. And he denounced this, saying it's a beastly plan. He was again one of these English-educated guys. Terrible form. But what the British did quietly was slip him £100,000. And the next day he changed his tune. And he was in favor of partition. So the British took this up to a fine art, yeah.
And then moving on, because we're running out of time, moving on, we come to the book where you're possibly on some of your weakest ground, and where you're certainly less than generous. Struggling in one or two occasions. Tea, cricket, and in the English language.
What about the railways? You haven't come to that.
I've come skip 10 seconds. Tea, cricket, and in English. Tea, you acknowledge, is quite good, except you then have to point out that it ravages the natural habitat as they planted things, which really is struggling a bit since every development does that.
No, but my point is that the British actually grew tea in India for themselves in England. It was not for us. It was only the Great Depression that suddenly left them with vast quantities of unsold tea because the British could no longer afford to import tea in the quantities they had in the past, that obliged them to cultivate an Indian market. And that's how we all became tea drinkers.
And then
Otherwise, it was just a narrow elite.
And then you come to cricket and you say, well, that was just for the Brits, so the fact that they left it behind is just a coincidence.
No, but
the railways were a great construction scam. I mean, the current usefulness of the railways is irrelevant. It was a construction scam, which means that people learn quite well because aren't people in Andhra Pradesh so good at corruption scams? Which brings me on to Sir Arthur Cotton. You
let me answer the railways for a minute.
All right.
I was expecting that to come up as well.
Construction scam.
So, the colonial scam started with the construction. First of all, the railways were built for British purposes to explore and open up the Indian hinterland, to take
That's not surprising. That's not surprising.
Take it out, move Indian labour, all of that. But, having said that, each mile of Indian railway actually costs 9 times the same mile in America, Canada, Australia. Why? Because the British guaranteed the most lavish returns paid for by Indian taxpayers' money to British investors. So there was no ceiling on expenditure. The more you spent, the higher a profit you could make. It was the single most profitable investment available on the British Stock Exchange between about 1850 and 1875. And that's why people actually profited. It was at that time described as private profit at public risk. But the private profit was for the Brits, the public risk was for us Indians. So that's the important point to know. Then, and I'm not even wasting your time now, it's in the book on all the racism that accompanied the running of the railways. Right up to the 1920s, every railway official, including ticket collectors, had to be European. But that's neither here nor there. What the railways actually did, apart from extracting our goods and taking them to ports to be shipped off to England, was they charged British companies the lowest freight rates in the world. But when they added on passenger carriages for Indians, with those appalling wooden benches that were all that Indians were allowed to sit and sleep on, they had the highest passenger rates in the world. So if today's Indian railways have actually made it useful for the Aam Aadmi, it's because we've reversed that approach. We have relatively high freight rates and the cheapest passenger rates in the world. So we've actually taken this colonial instrument and transformed it into something that benefits ordinary Indians. That's the difference.
And you're also unkind, although a bit inconsistent, on the things that you acknowledge some British work which was really good, like irrigation and other development things. And at one point you say, talking about Corbett Cotton and others, you dismiss them as ugly, pallid, which I assume means light-skinned, ugly, pallid, bilious men.
Oh, but
that's on page 66. But if you read through to page 250, you acknowledge clearly this was written a few weeks or months later. Something good had happened. That their good works are still remembered by the Indians whose lives they changed. So, for example, Sir Arthur Cotton and his irrigation in what is now Andhra Pradesh. Irrigation, of course, although you don't mention this, irrigation, of course, which taught a whole generation of rich farmers and contractors how to work with the government and work with the government in the ways that contractors do work with the government, which they then went to Hyderabad and profited on and has now become international names and heavily indebted. There's a bit of history you've left out, but you do switch from ugly, pallid, bilious men to good work still remembered by the Indians.
Right, but you see the point is, that lovely phrase, sadly, is not mine. It's a left-wing Briton called John Maynard, who said, ugly, pallid, bilious men were able to do great things in the very midst of their querulous discontents and unideal aspirations. And then I, in my own words, say, I'd like to make it clear that it is not my intention, this is page 250, to discredit every single thing the British did in India. As with all human enterprises, colonialism too brought positives as well as negatives. Not every British official in India was as rapacious as Clive, as ignorantly contemptuous as Macaulay, as arrogantly divisive as Curzon, as cruel as Dyer, or as racist as Churchill.
And I think that the point on which you're weakest and which probably you write with the least self-confidence is the question of united India. Did the Brits unite India, or would it, if the British had not come or had not stayed and ruled for so long, would Britain have been united? You won't acknowledge
Oh, Britain is not united.
That came years later. And you say it could. You say it was entirely possible that it could have been done by some Indian ruler, maybe by the Marathas. But you don't actually argue this. You say you don't disagree. You don't agree that Britain united it in the way nobody else could, and you say it's just possible. And that is, I think, the weakest paragraph in the whole book.
Okay.
You're not really convinced on this one. You may be convinced.
But I'll tell you why, because
the crusade stops at this point.
It's a counterfactual, right? So I'm saying that you have to look at the evidence, and I would argue that throughout Indian history, going back to way before, going back to the Vedas, there has been a sense, a yearning for national unity. There's a reference in the Vedas to the land of Bharatvarsh, the Himalayas, to the oceans. You've got periodic attempts to unite the entire subcontinent, Ashoka and the Chandragupta and the Mauryas, including particularly Ashoka, the Guptas later in the north, the Mughals, of course, and in the south, the Vijayanagar Empire. Every time people came to power and had a credible amount of power, they tried to expand. And the only limits they knew were indeed these civilizational limits. If Shankaracharya could leave my home state of Kerala in the 7th century and travel all the way to Kashmir, all the way north to Kashmir, establish a math, all the way in the west to Dwarka, all the way in the east to Puri, it was obviously because there was a sense of a common civilizational space, a common culture, what Diana Eck calls the shared sacred geography of the country. And it wasn't just a Hindu thing. Maulana Azad has written about how Muslims going on the Hajj, whether they were Pathans or Tamils, were always called by the Arabs as Hindis, because there was a sense in the Arab world of a common space called Hind. So there was always this one national ideal that everyone could aspire to, and that people tried to. So what were the Marathas doing at their peak? They expanded extensively. They actually got to Delhi, and they kept the Mughal emperor as a de facto hostage, but they nominally paid allegiance to him. He was still the emperor of India. They controlled the land. Now you could well see in that, had the British not come, the kernels of a potential Indian Union evolving into a kind of constitutional monarchy eventually. The Malaysians did something that could have happened. For example, they got all their Rajas and princes into a chamber, and from there they elect a king every once in a while to be the king of Malaysia. Now you could well imagine, maybe we wouldn't need to elect a king if everyone agreed on the Mughals, but certainly you could have enjoyed a situation where all the Rajas kind of ran an upper house and the lower house, sort of our Rajya Sabha quite literally, and then the lower house could have become democratic. Now, all this is speculative, obviously, so that John can argue this is your guess, it's as bad or as good as anybody else's guess, fair enough. But I'm extrapolating from those currents and trends before the British came that already existed in Indian history, and with modern communications and the ease of travel and so on, who knows, it could actually have been much more possible than in the preceding years when you didn't have good roads, railways, planes, telephones, etc., which obviously you don't have to be colonized to acquire.
And with that dream, Shashi, we close it down, I'm afraid. It's 4 o'clock. I've been told we've got to finish. We have no time to open it up.
Questions?
No?